Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilor Canellis?
Present.
Councilor Palumbo?
Present.
Councilor Picciarelli?
Present.
Councilor Woodland?
Present.
Councilor Bays?
Present.
Councilor Donato?
Present.
Councilor Falcoff?
Present.
Councilor Feltner?
Present.
President Sedaris.
Present. Thank you. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
15%, that's good.
The next item is public forum. This is a sign-up public forum. I see one person, Tom Sullivan. Please step up and identify yourself, and under the council rules, you're allowed to speak for 2 minutes, and we don't respond back right away.
Okay. Tom Sullivan, 11 Upland Road, Watertown, Mass. Former Recreation Director for the town from May of '73 to November of 2009. I saw on your agenda an item, Arsenal Park improvements, voting for design monies. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I know I was at a Conservation Commission meeting, and I believe their plan calls for the elimination of 3 tennis courts, a 2-sided wall, bang board for tennis, could be used for just throwing a ball, playing catch, elimination of a volleyball badminton court, elimination of a court that can be used for street hockey, kickball, wiffle ball, dodgeball, having little kids teach them learning how to ride bikes. I'm confused why that's considered park improvements. On two other issues, the new courts down at Philipello Park, you got a basketball court, a soccer court, 4-square court, you got a road, you got a sidewalk, nothing to stop the ball in between. You got a distracted parent taking kids home from the park, ball goes out onto the roadway, you could have a problem. I don't know why there isn't a fence between the 2 openings. You have chain openings. And the final item is right adjacent. I saw an email from Councilor Canellis about the property on Grove Street, and I responded to you people that I think would be an ideal situation for CPA funding to purchase that. One, it would take some of the strain off some of our other parks. There's some controversy about community gardens. It might be a beautiful place to continue community gardens in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in public forum that didn't sign up? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item, which is the examination of minutes. Can I get a motion on the minutes of June 25th?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we adopt the minutes of June 25th as written.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The next item is President's Report, and it's a fiscal year 2021 budget process resolution, and I'm going to read it. Whereas Article 5 of the Watertown Home Rule Charter sets out a process for the development and adoption of the annual operating budget and capital improvement program, and whereas the town council wishes to establish a timeline consistent with the charter by which it will provide policy guidance to the town manager on the development of the budget and capital improvement program. And whereas such a timeline will also give town residents notice of their opportunity to offer input on these important financial matters. Now therefore be it resolved that the town council of the city known as the town of Watertown establishes the following timeline for the development of the fiscal year 2021 operating budget and capital improvement program. Number 1, the fiscal year 2021 preliminary budget overview will be presented to the town council by October 8th, 2019. 2, the town council will adopt its fiscal year 2021 budget policy guidelines by November 26th, 2019. Number 3, the proposed fiscal year 2021 to 25 capital improvement program will be presented to the town council by January 28th, 2020. And 4, that the town council will adopt its conceptual recommendations on the fiscal year 2021 to 2025 capital improvement program by March 10th, 2020, subject to the availability of funds. Can I get a motion on the resolution, please?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we adopt the resolution on the budget.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. The next item is presentations of petitions and proclamations and similar matters. This is a proclamation for Brian Costello, who just recently retired from the Watertown Housing Authority. I'm going to ask Vice President Picciarelli to read this for us.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
A proclamation congratulating Brian Costello on the occasion of his retirement as Executive Director of the Watertown Housing Authority. Whereas Brian Costello retired on May 20th, 2019 as Executive Director of the Watertown Housing Authority after 36 years of distinguished service, and whereas Brian Costello served as an active member of the Massachusetts chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, President of the Board of Directors, a member of the year 2016. And whereas Brian Costello formerly served as a member of the Board of Directors for the Watertown Boys and Girls Club and the Board of Directors for the New England Regional Council of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. And whereas Brian Costello has been a leader in the energy savings industry by guiding the Watertown Housing Authority into a comprehensive energy and water-saving performance contract that improved tenant comfort, minimized safety hazards, and reduced carbon emissions. And whereas Brian Costello has been exceedingly generous with his time and talent by attending to low-income families, elderly individuals, and persons with disabilities through the community. And whereas Brian Costello helped establish the Wade Group, Inc., a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing affordable housing to low-income households and to supporting the youth of the town of Watertown with a modern learning facility. Now therefore be it resolved that the city known as the town of Watertown extends its sincerest congratulations to Brian Costello on his retirement as the administrator of the Watertown Housing Authority and honors his outstanding contributions to the town of Watertown.
Thank you, Councilor Picciarelli. Can I get a motion on the proclamation?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The next item is motions, orders, and resolutions. And 7A is a resolution authorizing a transfer of funds in the amount of $25,000 from the fiscal year 2019 debt retirement short-term interest account to the fiscal year 2019 transfer to capital projects skating rink account in order to fund the replacement of the public address system. Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the council. As you recall, back on January 31, the proposed fiscal year 20 to 24 capital improvement program was submitted pursuant to the provisions of the Watertown Home Rule Charter and the Town Council resolution on the fiscal year 2020 budget process. As a follow-up, on March 12th, the Honorable Town Council adopted 29 conceptual recommendations on the fiscal year 20 to 24 capital improvement program. One of the conceptual recommendations reads as follows. It was number 17, was proceed with the fiscal year 2019 proposed loan order for $25,000 for the skating rink improvements for a new public address system. As a follow-up to that conceptual recommendation, correspondence was forwarded to you from Daniel Brothers, the skating rink director, regarding the need to replace the public address system soon and preferably this summer. The system right now is over 25 years young, if you will. The intent had been to bring forward a proposed loan order for the public address system, as indicated in the conceptual recommendation, but at this time, there are monies available to fund the replacement with the debt retirement short-term interest account as a result of not borrowing for some planned items in fiscal year 2019. So in accordance with the fiscal year, the conceptual recommendation, number 17, Mr. President, members of the council, respectfully ask your favorable consideration of the proposed transfer from the fiscal year 2019 debt retirement short-term interest account to the fiscal year 2019 transfer to capital project skating rink in order to move forward the replacement of the public address system this summer. Mr. President.
Thank you. Can I get a motion on the transfer?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we approve the transfer of $25,000.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Council Palumbo?
Yes.
Counselor Picciarelli?
Yes.
Counselor Woodland?
Yes.
Counselor Bays?
Yes.
Counselor Donato?
Yes.
Counselor Falcoff?
Yes.
Counselor Feltner?
Yes.
Counselor Canellis?
Yes.
President Sederis?
Yes, thank you. 7B is a resolution authorizing a transfer of funds in the amount of $42,048 from the fiscal year 2019 Town Council Reserve to the fiscal year 2019 election equipment account in order to fund the replacement of the election voting booths. Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Mr. President. As indicated on page 50 of the excuse me, fiscal year 2020 budget message, the Election Commission is scheduled to conduct 3 election exercises in fiscal year 2020, beginning on Tuesday, September 17. Additionally, as stated within the message, the monies were included in fiscal year 20 capital improvement program for the election voting booths would be included in a future loan order, a transfer of funds request. Correspondence was forwarded from Mr. Flynn indicating the need for the replacement of the voting booth soon, and preferably in advance of the September 17th preliminary election. As indicated in the Mr. Flynn's correspondence, the present voting booths were purchased in fiscal year 1996. All of these would be accessible to all voters with disabilities and with and without, and those who want to sit while voting. The correspondence indicated that the timeline would allow for the booths to be available for the preliminary election if necessary. So as a follow-up to, in order to move forward with this and replace the voting booth soon, I respectfully ask the Council's favorable consideration. The proposed transfer would be $42,048 from fiscal year Town Council Reserve to fiscal year 2019 election equipment, and this would be, again, to move forward to funding the replacement of the election voting booths. Mr. President.
Thank you. Can I get a motion on the resolution authorizing the transfer?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we approve the transfer of $42,048.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Counselor Feltner. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could you refresh my memory? I was thinking that we either upgraded the software or we had some new equipment the last time around, just briefly.
Mr. Tracy's going to handle that.
Thank you.
Mr. President, members of the Town Council, I think, Councilor, what you're remembering is last year we did the actual software, hardware of the counting of the ballots, that equipment.
Oh, okay.
This transfer is actually for the place that the residents and voters will actually stand and vote and mark their ballots.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, Counselor Bays.
I'm just curious what it's being replaced with, for $42,000. Is this, first of all, is it across the whole town?
It's across the whole town.
And what exactly, so right now, all we've got these little rectangular, it's just $42,000 seems like a lot of money for replacing exactly what we've got.
Right. My understanding is going to be 16 booths or 4. Each unit is like a square, and there's 4. Each corner, there's, I think, the picture and the materials that was sent to you, and there'd be 4 of them at each precinct, and that's what this would be replacing. I think those are the numbers.
So,
Counselor Felkoff.
I'm sorry, I didn't look at the picture, and so these are going to be like, not everybody will be in the same plane. Currently, it's like lines of booths, and these will be fancier.
Currently, and I'm going by the precinct that I vote at, they're all in a line.
Yeah, right.
They're all like that.
But this one, and there's a picture in the package.
She's
that looks
putting
like
it up
this.
now.
Okay. So there's
see anything.
4, it's a square, and there's 4 places that you would vote. Still provides the privacy.
Right.
And I do know.
Increased privacy, it looks
I
like.
do know that Mr. Flynn and the purchasing agent went to 2 communities, I think it was Waltham and Arlington, I'm not too sure if it's Arlington, and went and looked at these booths, and we're very happy with them.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Can I get a roll call, please?
Counselor Picciarelli?
Yes.
Counselor Woodland?
Yes.
Counselor Bays?
Yes.
Counselor Donato?
Yes.
Counselor Falcoff?
Yes.
Counselor Feltner?
Yes.
Counselor Pinellas?
Yes.
Counselor Palumbo?
Yes.
President Zaderis.
Yes, thank you. 7C is a resolution authorizing a transfer of funds in the amount of $250,000 from the fiscal year 2019 Town Council Reserve to the fiscal year 2019 Transfer to Capital Projects Arsenal Park account in order to proceed with the design of renovations and improvements at Arsenal Park. Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the council. Again, this is a follow-up to the Honorable Town Council's adopting 29 conceptual recommendations on the fiscal year 20 to 24 capital improvement program. Conceptual recommendation number 28 reads as follows: regarding Arsenal Park, for the fiscal year 2020, proposed loan order for $250,000 for design. Proceed subject to the condition that the Department of Community Development and Planning, in conjunction with the Conservation Commission and Recreation Department, shall hold community meetings to ensure that the work is consistent with the improvements proposed as part of the development mitigation, and have one or more informational presentations to the Town Council. And for the fiscal year 2020, proposed loan order for $4.3 million for renovations. Proceed subject to the condition that development mitigation and proposed iCube funds will offset a portion of the cost as planned. Subsequent to the adoption of that conceptual recommendation on April 9th, the Honorable Town Council adopted a resolution authorizing filing with the General Court of a petition for a special act for a public-private partnership to undertake renovations and improvements at Arsenal Park. Again, that occurred on April 9th. As a follow-up to both of those items, correspondence was forwarded to you from Mr. Magoon, the Director of Community Development and Planning, and Assistant Town Manager, respectively, request an opportunity to provide an update on Phase 1 of the Arsenal Park project, and respectively was looking to move forward a transfer for $250,000 in order to proceed with the design for the remainder of Arsenal Park. So at this point, I'll speak to the funding after the presentation, Mr. President, by Mr. Magoon. So at this point, I'd like to bring forward Mr. Magoon to provide an update on Phase 1, and as well as speaking to the proposed transfer moving forward, the design for the remainder of Arsenal Park. Mr. President, Mr. Magoon.
Thank you, Mr. Manager, Mr. President, members of the council. So what I'd like to do is touch base broadly speaking on the two aspects, both the entire park design and then the Phase 1, which has been, as you well know, celebrated. So in terms of the entire park, we've had a number of public meetings working with the Conservation Commission, going through a design process. They approved the conceptual design, which we then took to 25%. Back to the Conservation Commission, had additional public meetings, again, made some adjustments to that. As you can see with the plan that's before you tonight, that 25% design for the majority of the park is represented here. Phase 1 is the easternmost end of the park, which I'll get into a little bit more detail about in just a minute. The primary aspects of the park is that most people value the park as an amenity that has not only active recreation, but also a significant passive aspect to it. And I think a lot of people really appreciate the nature of the park in that context. So in that sense, we've left it for the majority primarily the way it is today. The eastern end of the park has, the existing playground, an expanded playground, actually adding some bathroom facilities for parents who have indicated concerns about that issue being adequately addressed where the playground is. Keeping the large play area, the amphitheater would be redesignated as sort of a natural play area that has natural features, and as well as a slide down, similar to some other examples that we have. It also would have a connection for the community path that would provide a connection from Arsenal Street down to the Charles River. That's something that was vetted with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Committee, as well as a number of public processes to do that. In the central area of the park, there was a lot of conversation about the hard court surfaces, and again, the Conservation Commission went forward with the design that you see before you tonight. There's still obviously opportunity, if we see fit, that, taking Mr. Sullivan's comments into account, I think the distribution and allotment of hardcourt surfaces in that area is a relatively minor design change. What we need to do is move forward with the design dollars to move forward with the design of the entire park. So now getting to the eastern end in Phase 1. As you all know, we've elevated that in terms of time frame for a couple of reasons. First and foremost is we have mitigation dollars from Arsenal Yards to provide $500,000 for the improvements of this end of the park. We also have pursued the special legislation in order to improve that as a public-private partnership. The timing of that, trying to get some of that in place by this fall. We've also, with the direction of the council, submitted a housing choice community grant to apply $250,000 also to this end of the park. So a lot of pieces moving there. We've elevated this design, so this is now at about 75%, so we can get pricing and move forward with the eventual construction in this public-private partnership. The eastern end has a number of seating areas with trees, a pavilion, a knoll, a raised area that would be vegetated. Also have a path that would go up to the top to provide a bit of an overlook over the river, as well as the remainder of the park. It would also have an open green area with seating along the edges, which then will transition down to the community garden space. The community gardens is not in this Phase 1. The border to Phase 1 would be that eastern edge of that green area. And I would make one note that this eastern end doesn't include some of the issues that Mr. Sullivan was raising in terms of ballparks and playfields. So we've got the design elevated. We've done some borings to make sure we knew what was underneath the areas where there'd be structural issues, where the pavilion is, and some of those things. Significant landscaping, as well as improvement of the promenade along the northern edge of the park, which this would just be the beginning of. So that's sort of some of the highlights of the Phase 1. Again, the request before you tonight is to move forward with funding for $250,000 to complete the, or not complete, but proceed with the design aspect of the rest of the park. Also, I'll mention next Wednesday, this will be back before the Conservation Commission again to pursue the NOI notice of intent for the improvements to Arsenal Park for the Conservation Commission as well. So with that, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President, I'll turn it back to you.
Back to the manager.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Just very quickly, before I open up the questions for Mr. Magoon, as indicated in conceptual recommendation number 28, the intent had been to bring forward a proposed loan order for the $250,000 for the design of the renovations and improvements at Arsenal Park, but as I indicated, monies are available in the fiscal year 2019 Town Council Reserve to fund the design. So again, Mr. President, members of the council, I respectfully ask your favorable consideration of the proposed transfer for $250,000 from fiscal year 2019 Town Council Reserve to the fiscal year 2019 transfer to capital projects, Arsenal Park, $250,000. Mr. President.
Thank you. Can I get a motion on the resolution?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we approve the transfer of $250,000.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. Councilor Canellis.
Thank you. What type of time frame do we anticipate for this phase of the
For
project?
Phase 1, we would begin construction in September. Hope to have most of the major construction done this construction season, probably do some of the landscaping in the spring.
Okay, and the pavilion, I noticed it's up by the picnic tables, et cetera. Can you tell us, I hope some of this material used is going to be maintenance-free? Or close to?
Yeah. What CDM has proposed is a pavilion, and I apologize, I didn't bring a drawing of that, but it's a timber frame pavilion with four corner posts and sort of an awning look to it. But as timber, it, would be wood, so isn't as maintenance-free as perhaps a metal structure would be. But anything, I'm sure would last, in a dozen, tens of years, decades of years, not short-term. And that would be true with metal facility as well.
Thank you.
Yep.
Councilor Palumbo.
Yeah, just need to thank you for your presentation. Just a couple of quick clarifications for myself. The money that we're moving from the town council reserve is for the the rest of the park. Is that right for the design? So the park, the 75% is, which is the 75%?
It's just phase one.
Just this little spot over to the right?
Yes, so-
It doesn't even include the rest of the, okay.
So what's been 75% design is just this. The remainder is at 25%, and what we're requesting tonight, the 250,000, would be for the design of the rest of the park.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Councilor Feldner.
Thank you. Could you tell me what a tree bosque is? What does that mean?
So that area would be like a crushed stone surface, so it'd be permeable. The tree box would be a box that would separate out the root ball from the remainder of that area so that the tree roots would remain below that, and you still have that smooth surface above that, where also there'd be chairs and tables and chairs. So the tree box is a separate area, mulched for the tree root ball itself.
So so it's meant to be pedestrian populated among the trees, is what you're
Yes,
saying? Is it okay?
exactly. Chairs and tables amongst the trees and the trees.
Okay. And if I could continue, would you say that basically this whole area is passive? Is that how you would describe phase one?
I would say phase one is, yes, passive. It's not active in that it's not a ball field or anything of that nature. The natural grass areas are meant to be multi-purpose, so you could use them for pretty much anything.
And we're just voting tonight on phase one, or the language was we're also giving approval to move forward with?
No, so tonight, phase one, I was just giving you an update to let you know this is where we were with that design at 75%. The funding request is to design the remainder of the park.
Oh, right. So can you describe what that entails, the 250,000, how that would be used for the remainder of the park, what the approach is?
So
Those
that would
funds.
involve the detailed engineering analysis that goes into taking a 25% design all the way through the rest of the design process. And again, we'll work through that in phases with the Conservation Commission and the public, going back at probably, again, 75% design. Say here's the next cut at that, get their input, and make any changes necessary at that point, tweaks, adjustments.
So is there a time frame yet for phase two? Or it sounds like there may be more than 2 phases for the remainder of the park.
No, I would say the rest of it, I would say, is phase two. In terms of timing, I think that depends a little bit because CDM is both working on phase one as well as right now working on Victory Field phase two. So I'm not sure exactly the timing of how quickly they could get the remainder of the park to 75% design. So I don't have exact time frame for you, but if we got that approved, I'm sure we're talking, months.
I guess I would just say that my overall impression with this being passive is this is really built to the benefit of Boylston Properties versus the full town, and I can appreciate that. This is really important for the town and for the developer, and we really want this to be successful. I have concerns, but I know that it's been a difficult process, and I'm glad that we're working in public-private public-private partnership, and would hope that we have a lot of outreach to the community as we move forward to the rest of the phase, so that people that have given their emails and come to these other meetings are specifically contacted for this project.
One aspect I would follow up on that, while, you know, the easternmost end certainly does provide a lot of connection and benefit to Arsenal Yards as a project, but also I think, you know, if you think about how that part of the park has been used for decades, it has been largely neglected and not very well used by almost anybody. So I think, you know, this will really bring some activation to it and some benefit for the community in general as well. But you're right, it'll certainly be a benefit to Boylston as well.
So, and my last, just confirmation, is the town maintaining Arsenal Park? Who in the end is going to be responsible for maintenance?
Town property.
So, okay, that's a concern as well. Thank you.
Councilor Bays.
So my question is, okay, so we're looking at Phase 1, which is 75% design, and then Phase 2, the other part is 25% design. So how set in stone is that 75% design, and how set in stone is this 25% design? Like, is the 75% design, that's pretty much what it's going to look like? The 25% design could change relatively significantly? I mean,
Yeah, I would, I guess, answer that two ways. One, I would say nothing's set in stone until it's literally set in stone, until it's constructed. But, you know, clearly, in each step of the process, as we progress, you know, we set out a plan that gets tweaked, and we say, okay, now let's move to the next step. So when we move to that next step, it's based on what we have. That's not to say that in that process that there might not be an opportunity to make some adjustments and some changes. The scope of the things that we are, I think it's reasonable to adjust and change.
Smaller.
Gets smaller, yeah. So, you know, as we get down to the details, sure, there'll still be some adjustments, but we're beginning to narrow down, you know, what the end product will be.
Councilor Palumbo.
Thank you. I apologize for my question. I remember my question now. The eastern part, I know that we're talking about the $250,000 for the other, but the eastern part, just to clarify, the home rule petition we submitted to make it a public-private partnership, that is to access $500,000 from Boylston as part of, but it was it, I'm trying to remember whether it was part of their permit or what it was part of the.
That's mitigation for their last phase, which is Building F.
Okay.
That'll be on the planning board's agenda tomorrow night, and a condition is their commitment to that $500,000.
Okay. I was mixing it up with the other thing. Thank you.
Councilor Canellis.
Thank you. Following up on Councilor Feltner's comment about maintenance, certainly we've always maintained the majority of the park, and this has been, the east end of the park has been an area that's really not endured very high traffic. But I would venture to say that 9 months out of the year, once this particular portion of the park is developed, it's going to need daily maintenance, trash receptacles and other items that will need to be picked up to maintain it. And I think we need to make it perfectly clear with the developer that he needs to participate, he being the Arsenal Yards, needs to participate in the maintenance of this section, in this private-public partnership that we are entering into, because I don't think that our DPW and our outside vendor has the capabilities of monitoring and servicing this portion of the park on a daily or bi-daily basis.
Well, I can certainly have additional conversations with the developer. There hasn't been a commitment to them to do that at this point.
Well, the entire area is picnic tables and seating areas, and it's a lot of concrete, but certainly there is landscaping vegetation, and if people are coming down the walkways and you know, having their food from the vendors, there's going to be associated litter and trash that needs to be maintained. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very pretty location, and the responsibility should not fall on the town.
Are
Thank
there
you.
any other questions? Counselor Donato?
To follow up on Counselor Canellis's question, just to clarify, this public-private partnership is specific just to the construction.
Correct.
And once the construction ends, that ends the public-private partnership. And that's the reason why you said that the town is responsible for all the maintenance.
Yeah, it's town property, and we can certainly have a conversation about that. You know, it's certainly in the developer's interest that this be a nice end of the park, but there's no commitment at this point for them to do that.
Are there any other questions? Can I get a roll call, please?
Counselor Woodland?
Yes.
Counselor Bays?
Yes.
Counselor Donato?
Yes.
Counselor Falcoff?
Yes.
Counselor Feltner?
Yes.
Counselor Pinellas?
Yes.
Counselor Palumbo?
Yes.
Counselor Picciarelli?
Yes.
President Sederis?
Yes, thank you. The next item is item 8As, with their committee reports. 8A is the Committee on Economic Development and Planning Report regarding the zoning ordinance excavation work requirements. Councilor Woodland is the chair. Councilor Woodland.
Thank you. The committee convened on Monday, June 10, 2019, at 6:30 p.m. in the Philip Payne Lower Conference Room. President myself, Chair, Council Felton, Vice Chair, Council Petrelli, Secretary, Staff President Steve Magoon, Assistant Town Manager, Director of Community Development and Planning. Committee members are David Stokes and Charlie Brightrose. The purpose of the meeting was to examine whether there are appropriate modifications to the zoning ordinance requiring excavation work that will provide more protection to neighbors. Mr. Magoon provided a handout with the relevant Section 8 of the zoning ordinance with the proposed language that would require a community meeting for removal of ledge, which is attached. The discussion covered the following points. Ledge can usually be removed with an excavator bucket and sometimes a handheld jackhammer, which the committee agreed is not a problem. Sometimes more powerful equipment is required to remove ledge, such as an excavator-mounted hydraulic jackhammer or rock breaker, which is considerably louder and causes significantly more vibration. Excavator-mounted hydraulic jackhammers are often used on special permit projects, which have community notification and public hearings, unlike by right building permits. What recently occurred at 71 Salisbury Road, a one-time event. Could such a situation occur somewhere else? And if this proposed language existed, could the situation be avoided? Unlike projects with a special permit, the by right building permit process has no formal method to address ledge removal with heavy equipment, such as the condition of a building permit. So besides 71 Salisbury Road, Mr. Magoon could not recall when another situation similar to this has occurred. He further noted that such use of equipment would not have been prohibited in this limited situation, and while there are not formal regulations in place, the building inspector would make a determination on how such equipment would be used in accordance with current construction standards. Councilor Feltner and Picciarelli felt there was value in requiring neighbors to be notified when such heavy equipment will be used on a by right project in a residential neighborhood. I did not believe additional regulation was needed. And then I can read the action item, which was voted on 2-1 with myself voting no. The meeting adjourned at 7:23 p.m. Report prepared by Councilor Vince Picciarelli.
Can I get a motion to accept the report?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the report? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Before I ask for an action item on, that was voted on, just a reminder that this would require us to have a first reading and referral to the planning board. So by voting this tonight, we could move it. The process still has a ways to go. It would come back to the council. So can I get a motion that the council move forward with an amendment to the zoning ordinance for changes in section 8.0 as presented in the attachment by removing the phrase "other construction as described above" and replacing it with "a by right construction project using a vehicle-mounted hydraulic jackhammer or rock breaker"?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Councilor Palumbo.
Could someone from the committee put this into, just explain it a little more in terms of what we're, or Mr. Magoon, either, whatever you say, Council President, but could I have a little more explanation, please?
Sure. So the concern was with the project on Salisbury Road that there was a significant amount of jackhammering that went on for a number of days, and it was very disruptive. So the concern being that we have an opportunity, if there's that kind of heavy-duty rock removal, that there be an opportunity to have a conversation with the neighbors, talk about the duration and methods and so on and so forth. The vehicle-mounted, basically vehicle-mounted sledgehammer or jackhammer was a way to try and distinguish between that and, you know, a handheld jackhammer. It's really much more minor in nature and not as intrusive. So if the operation was going to have this very intrusive, you know, vehicle-mounted jackhammer, that there'd be an opportunity to have that conversation and hopefully create some understanding and minimize impacts.
But this is,
Yes, go ahead.
but this is by right, right? I mean, are you saying that now we're changing the by right? That people who by right could build a house but have to remove some ledge? If we vote on this now, those folks who have that by right now, and they decide they need a jackhammer that's mounted, they have to do what?
It would, well, first of all, as Councilor President said, there's several more steps.
Right,
before it would
right,
happen.
I'm sorry, yeah, but,
But assuming that that does happen.
Right.
So they would have to have a neighborhood meeting, notify their neighbors, have a community meeting, and discuss the methods, the duration, the quantities, how they would go about that. And, you know, so there might be an opportunity to, if a particular neighbor, you know, works nights, that maybe they could avoid time so they could sleep, you know, just as a hypothetical. But those types of things. And so that there's an expectation, a clear expectation, understanding between both the developer and the neighbors as to what's going to happen.
do you have any other, historically, do you know of any other times where we've imposed something on the by right, it's like we're doing, if this was to happen, like this particular situation?
I would say that this is a pretty unique circumstance. And as you know, we've talked a lot about by right projects, and I feel pretty strongly that I don't want to set up a frustrating situation where we require actions that then people think there's, you know, an opportunity to stop something that's allowed by right. So I do share that concern if that's.
That's where I was going.
Yeah. But in this case, I think this is a pretty unique set of circumstances and can be pretty impactful. So at least having an opportunity to have that conversation and maybe alleviate some issues, I don't necessarily have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Councilor Falcoff.
Yeah, it seems it's also just about giving the neighborhood notice about what's going to happen, because otherwise it's like all of a sudden there's this big noise. So I appreciate that. But part of what happened at Salisbury Road and is also that there was encroachment on the neighbors, trees on one side, the neighbor's ledge on another side, I believe. And so this change doesn't address that. And can you comment on that?
Sure. I would say there's a couple of directions we can go there. I mean, there are times when something is very obvious and egregious, and that's, you know, clearly something that we would want to be involved in and try and avoid. I don't think Salisbury Road was that case. I think that there was a foundation wall, they were moving loose rock, and there was, you know, a half a foot or so of loose rock between the property boundary and the foundation. So as they removed it on their side of the property, the rest just fell in, and so they removed that too. I don't think it was an intention to encroach and go into the neighbor's property, which they're rectifying and backfilling and doing that. But I think that kind of a situation, to the extent that the neighbor really takes issue with it, becomes a neighbor property dispute, which is not something necessarily the town should resolve or
Legislate.
get in the middle of.
The rectifying, is that being done just out of the goodness of their heart, or what?
Council, let's focus on
Oh,
what's in front of us, not what's happening to rectify a situation. Councilor Woodland.
Could you confirm for me something that we discussed at the committee level, and that is the building inspector has the ability to dictate the time and duration and the other criteria for using a more intrusive jackhammer. So they could already say, you can only use this during business hours, Monday through Friday. They already have that ability. And in this case, the reason why this came forward is because they used it without notifying the building inspector.
I think there's two issues. Well, first, to answer your question, yes, the building inspector could say that you can't use it beyond these hours, clearly. One of the extenuating circumstances with this one was that the previous building inspector had a conversation with the builder about the ledge on the property. There was a commitment made by the builder that if he did have to remove a certain amount of ledge, that he would hold a community meeting and discuss it with the neighbors. Obviously, unfortunate situation with our building inspector passing away. The new building inspector wasn't aware of that discussion, that previous arrangement. So the developer moved forward. There was at least some expectation in the neighborhood that there would be a community meeting. None was held, and that has certainly, I think, elevated that issue.
Councilor Canales.
Thank you. I support this measure, even though it doesn't specify encroachment and everything else that has occurred in these other, in at least this one other project on Salisbury Road. But it does give the neighborhood this window of opportunity where everyone is placed within one area where they can open up and ask questions. It's not denying anybody their right of going through a project that would be considered by right. It just gives this opportunity to say, well, what if? Can we contact you? Are you going to threaten us? Because there were threats made, or at least perceived threats between abutters. There were issues with trees. It would have given the neighbors the opportunity to say, well, excuse me, I have shrubbery. Can you please be cautious of it? It's an open dialogue in a civilized manner where everyone's coming together and has this wonderful opportunity to speak up one-on-one, as opposed to after the fact and everyone's running around trying to figure out who's responsible. And we, as counselors, received all of the emails that were going back and forth, and we really didn't get very much accomplished. Had that meeting occurred prior to, everyone's anxieties would have been eased and the process would have continued in a very appropriate manner and everyone knowing what was going on. So I will certainly be supporting this for it to move through our internal process. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Councilor Feltner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to add that at the committee meeting, Mr. Magoon and Councilor Piccirilli did a nice job of explaining the unusual situation in that when you read this, it says vehicle-mounted hydraulic jackhammer. So this is pretty unusual and very heavy-duty equipment, and staff does, I think, keep in mind impacts around projects, but given the large impact in a situation like this, staff can't possibly know what neighbors' needs are, perhaps, et cetera. So that's why we came up with this action item. Thank you.
Councilor Woodland.
Mr. Magoon, would you be able to confirm for me as well that as a result of one of these meetings, there's no guarantee that this meeting changes anything?
No, that's true. The opportunity to have that, there's obviously scenarios where you have that community meeting and there's a large disagreement and there isn't a resolution, but I would say that even in that case, as some of the other councilors have noted, at least there's an understanding of what's going to happen. And in the best case scenario, there is an opportunity to mitigate some impacts and come to some agreement, but there's certainly no guarantee of that.
I guess just to follow up, if I may, the reason why we do community meetings for large-scale developments, why it's in the zoning ordinance, is because we want to have residential input be considered, and there is an impact. If someone was to have 2 community meetings and then go to the planning or zoning board and they didn't make a single change, didn't listen to a single resident, didn't listen to anybody, I think that would hold some water. but this isn't that type of scenario. So I guess the reason why I oppose it at the committee level, and I'll oppose it tonight and whenever we get it again, is because the meeting has no teeth. We already have the ability to regulate this internally. And I think what was alluded to earlier is going to be most true, in that if I want to try to stop my neighbor from doing a by right project, this is my chance to get out, which is not what this is intended for and not what by right is for. And again, I think this is one of these traps the council falls into whenever a very isolated incident happens in town and we get a couple emails about it. We're trying to overcorrect for a once in a 100-year situation, and our overcorrection is going to have potential negative impacts beyond what we're trying to fix. So,
Are there any other questions or comments? Councilor Palumbo.
Okay, I just want to be clear that this meeting is only if there is ledge to be removed. This is not a general meeting about a by right project. This is a meeting when ledge is going to be removed, and the instrument that's used in the ledge removal is this hydraulic, this jack, post-mounted jack. Is that correct?
Vehicle-mounted.
Vehicle-mounted jack. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? I just want to say that I do share the concern that Mr. Magoon pointed out, that some people, if this comes up in the neighborhood, it's a by right project, are thinking, wow, we're going to get to go to a meeting and change everybody's mind. And so I do think that I would like to hear from the planning board to see what they would feel, because some of them are dealing with these things more often than we are. So I will vote to move this forward, but I do have some concerns that we're creating a false hope for a neighborhood that may not ever come to fruition, because, just because they have a meeting doesn't mean that they're going to change their mind. So can I get a roll call on this, please?
Councilor Bays?
Yes.
Councilor Donato?
Yes.
Councilor Felkoff?
Yes.
Councilor Feltner?
Yes.
Councilor Canellis?
Yes.
Councilor Palumbo?
Yes.
Councilor Picciarelli?
Yes.
Woodland?
no.
President Sedaris?
Yes. Thank you. 8B is the Committee on Economic Development and Planning report regarding the Transportation Management Association, TMA, progress, and the Transportation Demand Management, TDM, annual report. Councilor Woodland.
Thank you. The committee convened on Tuesday, June 18, 2019 at 6 p.m. in the Philip Payne Lower Conference Room. President were myself, Chair, Council Feltner, Vice Chair, and Council Petrelli, Secretary. Staff President were Laura Wieners, Senior Transportation Planner, Steve Magoon, Assistant Town Manager, Director of Community Development and Planning, and there's the attachment A for a list of all attendees. The purpose was to update the folks in the room on the progress of the Transportation Management Association objectives and the Transportation Demand Management Annual Report. The TMA was first. Mr. Magoon began by noting the TMA is more than just the shuttle and encompasses a range of other programming, and provided an overview of the TMA by reviewing material in prior reports of April 10, 2018 and July 10 of 2018, and those have been linked to these minutes as well. As an update since last meeting, he noted the following regarding the shuttle. With the town council's appropriation of funds to the shuttle program last year, the expectation was that the program would move more quickly, but it has been difficult to do so. Pleasant Street was previously the priority because it lacks public transit, but the TMA is now looking to start on Arsenal Street because that is where the bigger demand is. The TMA believes that leveraging the existing private shuttles along Arsenal Street may be the most viable way to create a successful community shuttle, building upon existing success. Next, Bridger McGaw from Athena Health, who is the president of the Watertown TMA, spoke about the organization, and that's in attachment B. He said the TMA looked at multiple proposals over the last few years to expand shuttle opportunities, and they are currently working with Arsenal Street businesses and residential properties, as well as Tufts Health Plan, to expand access to MBTA transit hubs through the existing Athena Health shuttles. This new partnership is called the Watertown Connector, and they are hoping to launch it soon using proven methods by We Drive You, which is Athena's best-in-class transportation service provider. They are working out routes and logistics as well as mobile boarding methods. and employee engagement efforts to encourage ridership. The committee and members of the public spoke about the following: why the shuttle pilot was taking so long, Athena Health special permit requires them to participate in the TMA, and why that was taking long. Why is community development and planning not developing a timeline and budget at this stage? There is a strong public interest to allow members of the public to ride the TMA shuttles. There's a question why there is a change of plans to prioritize Arsenal Street instead of Pleasant Street, what the specifics of the Watertown Connector Plan are, and can the committee come up with an alternate plan? And Mr. Magoon clarified that the Watertown TMA is an independent organization that is not part of the town government, but that the town of Watertown is a dues-paying member. The purpose of the TMA is to serve its members with programs to reduce traffic. The town of Watertown, by being a dues-paying member, enables members of the public to access the shuttle, but that the cost and fee structure for doing so has not yet been decided. The town council cannot direct the TMA to perform specific tasks and can only make requests. Mr. McGaw added the TMA is implementing best practices using professional shuttle operators, that data needs to be available in order to deploy resources effectively, and that building upon proven shuttle demand is critical to successfully expanding it community-wide. The committee requested the TMA provide an outline of the Watertown Connector Plan and an aspirational timeline, and subsequent to the meeting, Ms. Weiner provided additional information, which is found in Attachment C. Now, the second topic, the TDM, Transportation Demand Management. Ms. Weiner presented the 2019 TDM Annual Report in Attachment C and talked about the progress made last year. What is very encouraging is how few of the parking spots required under zoning are actually being used. For example, the Gables and Arsenal is at 93% occupancy, but only 43% of the parking spots are actually being used at night, meaning the worst-case conditions contained in the traffic studies have not occurred. This is an indication that the incentives to reduce car usage appear to be working. The committee and members of the public spoke about the following: the key to getting more people out of their cars to provide more transit options. With the current state of the MBTA, we need to develop short, medium, and long-term plans to transit alternatives. The connection to the Brighton Landing rail stop is seen as critical to improving commuting patterns. The positive trend in reduced ownership of cars for these large developments means we may want to reconsider zoning parking requirements. Why is Athena Health not providing TDM reporting as required by the special permit? It's a question that was raised, as well as can the information from the TDM checklist requirements be included in the TDM report? Regarding the Athena Health TDM reporting requirements, Mr. Magoon clarified that this only kicks in after they receive the certificate of occupancy on the parking garage, which has not yet occurred, as they have a temporary CO right now. Notes subsequent to the meeting. Again, Ms. Weiner provided the additional information, the TDM checklist requirements. Those are in Attachment C. The meeting adjourned at 8:21 p.m., and the report was prepared by Councilor Vincent Petrelli.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to accept the report?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Oh, Councilor Falco.
Was there an answer to the question why Athena Health hasn't done what it's supposed to? The question was raised, was it answered?
It's right, the last,
Yeah, it's right there.
second to last paragraph.
The question has to do with, in terms of the monitoring, has to do with the certificate of occupancy for the garage. They're still under
Right, right,
temporary
right.
certificate. Not
Is it appropriate to ask about the status of that?
Yeah, it's still temporary.
And
Yeah, I mean, there's still a number of issues we're working through.
you're working with them on it. Thank you.
Any other comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. 8C is the Committee on Media and Public Outreach Report regarding kitchen table conversations. Councilor Palumba.
Thank you. The committee met on June 17th at 5 o'clock to finalize plans for the June 23rd meeting for potential hosts of the kitchen table conversations. Attending included myself, Councilor Feltner, Vice Chair, Councilor Bay, Secretary Ora Gorski, Bill Madsen, Nancy Hammett, and Ed Dolan from Watertown Community Connections, and resident Stephanie Venzuelas and David Stokes. The meeting was called to order at 5 p.m. We reviewed the list of the 20 confirmed and potential hosts. The hosts cover a good cross-section of town. Councilor Feltner is continuing to reach out to residents in District B for additional hosts. We briefly discussed how to reach residents in the apartment buildings and condominiums in town. WCC member Cecilia Link will coordinate setting dates for the kitchen table conversations with hosts and facilitators. When a date is confirmed, district councilors will be invited to attend. The district council is unable to attend. At-large councilors will be invited, and the first to respond can attend. Town councilors' role will be to listen, learn, and serve as a resource as needed. The committee can finalize the agenda and logistics for the June 23rd meeting, including finalizing the questions that will be asked at the mock KTCs. WCC member Ori Gorski offered to get a room at the library in September when we will share the results of the kitchen table conversations. And WCC member Nancy Hammett volunteered to synthesize the data from the KTCs. The meeting adjourned at 7:00. The minutes were prepared by Councilor Bays.
Can I get a motion to accept the report?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Counselor Bays.
Just correcting a few things. It says Monday, July 17th at the top. It should say June 17th. And also, it's Watertown Community Conversations instead of Watertown Community Connections.
Who make those changes? Any other comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. 8D is the Committee on Rules and Ordinances Committee report regarding approval, issuance, and enforcement of building permits issued by the Department of Public Works and the Building Department. Councilor Donato.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Committee on Rules and Ordinances met on Thursday, May 2nd, in the Philippine hearing room. Lower level present were myself, Chair, Councilor Woodland, Vice Chair, Councilor Lisa Feltner, Secretary. Also present were Councilors Anthony Palumba and Caroline Bays, as well as numerous town employees that are listed in the committee report. The agenda, as previously mentioned, was to review the internal processes regarding the approval, issuance, and enforcement of permits issued by the DPW and the Building Department. I called the meeting to order at 5 p.m. by pointing to 3 relatively high-profile and recent projects that had caused concern in the community: 73-75 Moore Street, 71 Salisbury Road, as well as Oakley Country Club impacts on Arden and Oakley Roads. I suggested that the town might want to pump the brakes on future projects that are particularly unique to make sure that everyone in town knows what's going on. It seems that staff coordination can be a little tricky given the physical separation of the Department of Community Development and Planning, the Building Department, and DPW locations. It was noted that the Oakley Country Club project continued moving ahead, even though the town engineer advised them during the stormwater permit process to consult with the building department. I asked for a brief overview by the Department of Community Development and Planning of their processes. Councilor Feltner expressed the need for better public understanding of the procedures depending on the permit. Director Magoon suggested that DPW, Building, and Zoning have a good handle on what happens when people come into Town Hall and seek advice for getting work done. They coordinate via phone and email constantly. Superintendent Mee voiced his opinion that coordination between departments has greatly improved in recent years with very high interaction. Unfortunately, there are some applicants or contractors who don't heed advice or rules. He finds it more common to issue fines when excavation permits also require a sidewalk cross-cutting permit. Mr. Schuman stated that Oakley was the first application for a stormwater erosion control permit. He has since proposed a worksheet to be sure zoning is informed. Mr. Magoon confirmed that of the thousands of permits issued per year, it is a very small percentage that has problems. Debbie Healy recognized that lots of the onus is on the applicants to follow up with the town. There's not enough staff or inclination to chase every project. The building department does not review plans without an application and a permit fee, and they email quite frequently. The building inspector, Mr. McLaughlin, spoke about some new procedures that he has put into place with regard to a 30-day time frame once a building permit has been applied for. Mr. McLaughlin shared some frustrations with being short-staffed compared to neighboring communities. Council Feltner emphasized that the committee wanted to hear concerns as well as ideas as to what could be improved, such as technology, procedures, and addressing any loopholes and policies that would help with enforcement. She also asked what could be done to lighten the load of current employees. All employees present expressed a need for more staff. Zoning Enforcement Officer Mena felt that the current process forms seem sufficient as they indicate when the Department of Community Development conducts their reviews. There was some interaction between Councilor Palumbo, Mr. Magoon, and Mr. Me, as well as some town residents. Mr. McLaughlin shared that when he worked for the city of Cambridge, every 6 months or so, he would hold a seminar on how to pull a building permit and would be happy to do that here in Watertown. He would also love for the town council to have more of appreciation for the volume of the projects being handled, as he has spent many extra hours at the former Arsenal Mall. Council Feltner asked if there was some ways to streamline the process for smaller projects, such as adding skylights or dormers. Mr. McLaughlin would like that and said, "We do not have a checklist, unlike at his previous places of employment," and he felt that Watertown could use one. This is a more simple versus thinking one permit software system will fit all of our needs. Mr. Mena explained that there will be more interactivity across departments through new software, People Forms, which is building a site for the building, planning, and zoning, and we need to make sure that we have infrastructure in place to support that. There was some exchange between Councilor Woodland and some of the residents regarding specific projects such as Salisbury Road. Mr. Magoon stated that the building inspector had visited Salisbury Road every day and monitored the situation very well. Councilor Feltner asked if this situation would happen again because such project notes about property that Mr. Magoon referenced earlier regard to the previous building inspector were kept in a permit file and not in an email message. Mr. Magoon felt it creates a terrible situation to mandate public notification to neighbors and abutters because it gives them a false impression that they can protest or that they can stop something that is by right or has already been given approval. I shared some concerns that I have regarding matters that I would believe to be private civil matters that the town council should not get involved with. There was some more discussion on specific projects that had been the source of the meeting, causing the meeting to be called in the first place. And towards the end of the meeting, Councilor Woodland stated that he did not want to make any recommendations about improving the process because it gives the impression that either the department was derelict or the process was insufficient. I noted that we might not need revolutionary changes, and noted that Mr. Schuman had already made some changes and created a worksheet to address certain issues. Councilor Feltner noted that Mr. McLaughlin mentioned needing a checklist and was willing to provide informational seminars. The town council is not fully informed about the current internal processes, and other staff expressed a wish to produce educational materials, ideally for the website. Mr. Magoon acknowledged that things do change over time. We ended the meeting with an action item from Councilor Woodland that the town council recommends to the town manager that the Department of Community Development and Planning with DPW cooperation develop a building department brochure as suggested by Peter McLaughlin. This was seconded by Council Feltner and approved 3-0. There was then a motion to adjourn the current meeting and continue at a subsequent date with a focus on enforcement. That was seconded by Councilor Woodland, approved 3-0, and the meeting adjourned at 7 p.m. And the report was respectfully submitted by Councilor Feltner.
Can I get a motion to accept the report?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Can I get a motion that the council recommend to the town manager that the Department of Community Development and Planning with the Department of Public Works develop a building department brochure?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Let me just remind everyone at this point that recently we've been putting dates on these reports, and I'm going to ask you not to do that because recently we've moved committee reports to other meetings, and the dates aren't relevant, so please be cognizant that you should not put the date that it was read, because it may not get read that date, so we don't have to change it later. Counselor Picciarelli?
I think, though, it's really helpful to put the date that the report was approved by the council on it. So-
I understand, but Counselor Picciarelli, we've put off several committee reports
Right.
recently, so that's how our agendas are going to work going forward.
No, but I know the date can be changed as long as it's corrected, so. But it's just really hard when you go in the past to try to find, without the report on the date.
It's fine, that's my rule from now on. Unfortunately, it won't go on the agenda if it has a date on it. That's how we'll approach that. Committee, next item is Committee on Rules and Ordinances report regarding the enforcement of building permits. Counselor Donato.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, this was the Committee on Rules and Ordinances. We met Thursday, June 13th at 6 p.m. in the Town Council chamber. This was a continuation of the meeting that I just read the previous report on. Present were myself, Chair, Councilor Kenneth Woodland, Vice Chair, Councilor Lisa Feltner, Secretary. Also present were many town employees. You can reference the minutes to see who all was in attendance. The agenda item was to review the Department of Public Works and public department processes regarding the enforcement of building permits. I called the meeting to order at 6:15. The committee welcomed a similar type of discussion with the town employees as we had at the previous meeting regarding enforcement, the enforcement side of permits, including questions such as how do we find that permits are being violated, how do we bring them back into compliance, and are there particular areas that the staff feels needs to be addressed. The building commissioner, Peter McLaughlin, led the responses. It was a very informative discussion going into all three of those questions that were asked. Mr. McLaughlin emphasized certain things that he felt were just best practices for residents in town, and that they not pull a permit at the behest of a contractor. He also wanted the public to know that there were certain jobs that one might undertake that they didn't realize would need to pull a building permit for, such as replacing an interior door, even though it's not a structural door. He emphasized the point that oversight is required, and that best thing to do if there are any questions is to call the town to see whether or not a permit is required. He said that they like to have residents come into the department, and they want to make sure that people are in compliance for their own good, their own safety, and for insurance purposes. He said that many people do not realize that insurance companies check with the town first prior to pursuing claims, and one of the most important things you can do is get a building permit. He emphasized that the town is not here to slow construction projects down. They want to do their best, and especially in light of the fact we have part-time electrical and plumbing inspectors. Mr. McLaughlin recommended that residents review the HIC guide for homeowners online, and we included a link in the minute meetings to that guide for homeowners. Mr. McLaughlin once again reiterated that he would be glad to host a session for homeowners to go over requirements, share helpful information, direct residents to websites, and warn of pitfalls, etc. Zoning has also uploaded information on their website. Unfortunately, residents don't realize that employees can't get involved with civil matters, which often include private trees or fence repairs, but staff will refer people to appropriate links or websites and still usually follow up with a drive-by to make sure there are no zoning or building issues. Public Works has also been putting more material together and updating pamphlets on stormwater and other matters. We were informed that zoning and building can now look up permits for properties while in the field on their preloaded tablets, and that the town is divided into 5 different geographic areas. that the appropriate staff follows up, but zoning generally keeps an eye on a property until issues are resolved, and members of the zoning office are in the field almost every day. There were a total of 244 zoning enforcement cases over the past 6 months. 39 of them were cases that had no permits, which is about 16%. 6 were in June, 13 in May, and the total number of violations in 2018 were 568, of which only 88 were for no permit. Mr. McLaughlin also emphasized that the goal of the department is to get people into compliance, and that they are not the police department or acting like sheriffs, and oftentimes they're just trying to resolve a basic misunderstanding between homeowners and habitual offenders. Mr. McLaughlin and other building and zoning staff emphasized the need for more space and spoke to the benefits of being in the same space altogether. All of the town physical plans cannot fit together in a vault. Administrative staffs also help to serve as the first line of enforcement. Ms. Healy described staff hours and the scheduling of inspections, which include driving time in the field. Office hours are in the morning, and they can manage 7 to 8 inspections per day, not including safety inspections such as daycare facilities or at Perkins School for the Blind. Ms. Savetti suggested providing a comparison to other towns' fees as provided in previous years if warranted. Mr. McLaughlin felt Watertown is doing well, including the new final project cost affidavit, which has generated approximately $97,000 in new revenue this year. He thinks $15 per $1,000 is fair, but there are some certificates of inspections that are rather low cost. DPW would also want residents to know that even when National Grid determines an emergency work order, they are required to pull a permit, and there is additional information about that on the website. The action item from this was, there was a motion by myself, and this was in response to a request by town staff at the meeting, a motion by myself for referral to the Public Works Committee to review the fee structure / schedules for both Department of Public Works and the Department of Community Development and Planning. That motion was seconded by Councilor Woodland and approved 3-0. At 7:10, the meeting was adjourned by a motion from Councilor Feltner, which was seconded by Councilor Woodland and approved 3-0. And once again, these minutes were respectfully submitted by Lisa Feltner.
Can I get a motion to accept the report?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion, can I get a motion to refer to the Committee on Public Works a review of the fee structure, schedules for both the Department of Public Works and the Department of Community Development and Planning?
So moved.
It was just a question. Would the Committee on Public Works be taking up fees for the Department of Community Development and Planning? That doesn't quite seem right.
This is what came out of the committee.
And that was at the suggestion of Mr. Mano, because as he noted, the zoning enforcement office and the building inspector all fall under the Department of Community Development and Planning. So he felt as though it made more sense for it to be, I guess, a broad referral with the understanding that, it was going to be confined to those two departments. And the staff also mentioned that they were going to do some investigation on their own, so that when this meeting was called, there would be a more focused approach with what they would suggest.
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. President. Typically, the Committee on Economic Development and Planning reviews the fees for the.
Hang on one second. Could
Department
you
of Community
just second this first?
Second.
Okay, now continue.
Under the committee, the council rules that the Committee on Economic Development and Planning has always reviewed the Department of Community Development and Planning activities, not the Committee on Public Works. So that's why I'm just wondering, typically Public Works Committee reviews the DPW fees, and Economic Development and Planning reviews the Community Development and Planning fees. So do we want to have just the Public Works Committee review both departments, or do we want to have split it into?
Could be a joint meeting as well, but Counselor?
Thank you. I was going to comment that it came up that they said it could benefit to have a joint committee, but they'd leave it up to council if they wanted to have two separate committees, Public Works and Economic Development, or if it was more efficient to have a joint referral, but that would be okay with staff as well.
How does the council want to proceed? Councilor Woodland.
Not to be cheeky, but I'm just shocked that someone actually cares about this. I've been saying it for about a year, and this is the first time I haven't raised this issue. So this is great. This is a great step in the right direction. I'm very proud of the council this evening. I could care less how we move forward. Thank you.
I would respectfully request that we make it a joint referral to the Committee on Public Works and Committee on Economic
Why
Development.
don't we vote this down then, and then make a new referral?
I could withdraw my
Right.
motion.
I withdraw my second.
I withdraw my motion.
Well, it was an action item that they,
Okay, no, that's fine.
right?
This is why
Attorney
debate's a good
Rich?
thing.
Pardon me? Okay, let's amend it then.
Yes.
So since Councilor Falcoff already withdrew and Councilor Woodland already withdrew the second, why don't we make a new
Sure.
motion to refer to a joint committees on Public Works and Economic Development, a review of the fee structure and schedules for both the Department of Public Works and the Department of Community Development Planning.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Oh, hold on, Councilor Donato, sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. I just wanted to, and I apologize that I didn't read all of the employees' names because there were so many of them there. But I do just want to, once again, I know that this came up in the budget season. I think everybody on the committee was very appreciative of all of the town staff that came to the meeting. And I think it was really a great meeting, a lot of exchange of information. And I think the counselors who were there learned a lot. So I just wanted to thank Mr. Magoon and Mr. Me and their employees.
Okay, now all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. So it's a referral to two subcommittees. 8F is a Committee on Rules and Ordinances Committee report regarding the review of fees for liquor license granted pursuant to Chapter 73 of the Acts of 2016. Councilor Donato.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, Committee on Rules and Ordinances, we met Thursday, June 13th in the Town Council Chamber. Present were myself, Chair, Kenny Woodland, Vice Chair, Lisa Feltner, Secretary. Also present, Andrew Coppoletti of Boylston Properties, Attorney Bill York representing Boylston Properties, resident David Stokes, and DPW Superintendent Mr. Me and Town Engineer Matt Schuman were also present as this proceeded a subsequent meeting that they were going to attend. As the President mentioned, the agenda for the evening was to review the fees of liquor licenses granted pursuant to Chapter 73 of the Acts of 2016. I called the meeting to order at 5:30 with a brief recap of the April 17 committee meeting where we discussed unique circumstances of the Arsenal Yards project, as well as their request for additional liquor licenses. And you can see an attached letter from Mr. York of April 3rd, 2019. This meeting, however, was focused on the fees for the licenses and how they relate to the timing of the application process and planning needs. Attorney York thanked the committee for moving forward with the request to the Town Council and the Mass Legislature for additional liquor licenses. Mr. Coppoletti reviewed some of the previous discussion points about the very unique development at Arsenal Yards and such as the timing of the opening of the restaurants as well as when they need to apply for liquor licenses, the timeframes of these sorts for smaller business, that smaller businesses have to manage are important to understand. Oftentimes, a lessee is signing a lease in 2019 with plans not to open until sometime in the following year, and there was concern that the $8,100 annual license fee for the Chapter 73 Acts of 2016, that fee could be burdensome for some of these smaller restaurants that plan to open in Arsenal Yards. Attorney York stated that hopefully some of the pressure is taken off with the potential additional liquor licenses if granted by the state legislature, but the exception is that some lenders for these new restaurants that are going into Arsenal Yards require a liquor license to be secured early in the process. Councilor Woodland compared this situation to an existing restaurant that closes for a year for renovations and then argues that they don't want to pay for a license that year. So he is definitely not convinced and will likely not vote in favor of a reduced fee when the full council votes, but he hopes the Mass Legislature grants the additional licenses to Watertown. Mr. Coppoletti explained that this was not a financial gift for Boylston Properties, but about helping their tenants be successful. He stated that he understood if this did not pass, then the $8,100 fee would be a cost of doing business for the tenants, but he thinks that it's incumbent on Boylston Properties to ask and shed light on the realities of the Arsenal Yards development. It was noted that the annual license for a traditional liquor license is $2,100, whereas it's $8,100 for those that are quote-unquote leased by the town per Chapter 73 of the Acts of 2016. Council Feltner asked Mr. Coppoletti and Attorney York if they could point to other projects in similar circumstances for more information to help the council fully understand the dynamics. There are some similarities with Legacy Place, Market Street, and Linfield, and Dedham, as well as Assembly Row. But it's also somewhat dependent on economic conditions at the time, and there are currently a tremendous amount of competition for employees in some of those costs you cannot pass on to tenants. I noted for the record that the committee had received an email message regarding the meeting from Donna Doucette, who's the chair of the licensing board, and a copy of that email was attached to the minutes. I made a motion for the committee to recommend that the town council consider implementing a fee structure wherein Chapter 73 liquor license grantees would pay a reduced annual fee of $2,700 until such time they receive a certificate of occupancy. That was seconded by Council Feltner and approved 3-0. The meeting adjourned at 6 p.m. By motion that passed 3-0. And once again, these minutes were respectfully submitted by Council Feltner.
Before I ask for a motion to accept the report, the attachments did not get out with this, so I apologize for that. Let's first get a motion to accept the report.
Do you want to accept it with the, subject to the minutes,
Well,
attachments being attached?
But I also, if people aren't comfortable moving forward with the action item tonight, because there were no attachments, we can move that to another meeting. So if you could give me a motion to accept the report with the when the attachments get attached.
Okay, so the motion would be to accept the report, subject to the 3 missing attachments being
Yes.
added.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the report? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. How does the council want to proceed on the action item? Any comments? Councilor Woodland?
I'm content voting on it this evening.
Pardon me?
I'm content voting on it this evening.
Councilor Palumba?
I would like to know what Mr. Doucette's, what she said in that email. If let me say this, if it reflects any information on the motion, I would like to see it.
I'm going to suggest that we table the motion for another meeting.
I'll make a motion that we table the action item.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Councilor Feltner?
Yeah, I would like some information from the town attorney when he gets a chance, because when I read open meeting law, I was surprised to read that you're actually not required to attach materials that were presented at the meeting. I think it's good practice so that everybody knows what's going on, but thank you. And also, I just want to mention that what we're referring to was given to council in previous
I
meetings.
understand, but
I'm just,
some
for the
concerns were
record,
raised.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President,
Attorney
through
Rich.
you. Any documents that are referred to in the meeting would become documents of the meeting and would be subject to attachment to the minutes. So even though they're not available tonight, they would have to be made part of the record of this meeting. Certainly, it's within the council's purview to decide whether to act on something or not based on whether the council's feel there's enough information, but the documents themselves would ultimately become part of the meeting based upon the reference and referral to those documents within the meeting itself.
Councilor Donato?
I've been doing so much reading, Mr. President, that I would be happy there, Ms. Doucette.
No, we're not going to do that.
That's fine.
I'm going to suggest, because I've had some calls about people that didn't get these documents, and I want to be 100% comfortable that everybody knows what we're doing. So we have a motion on the second on the table. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
The ayes have it. Thank you. 8G is the Committee on Human Services and Rules and Ordinances report regarding noise regulations. Councilors Palumbo and Donato are the chairs. Is it Councilor Palumbo's turn to read? Councilor
I don't know if I could do it as well as you do, Anthony.
He's
but
been
I-
doing such a great job chairing these meetings, Mr. President, that I will defer to him.
The Committee on Human Services and the Committee on Rules and Ordinances met on Wednesday, April 3rd, to continue the discussion of revisions to the Noise Ordinance, Chapter 95. Councilors from the two committees were present, as well as Larry Random, the Director of the Health Department, Council President Mark Sideris, Councilor B, District Councilor Vincent Picciarelli, and members of the public. See the attached sign-in sheet. I called the meeting to order at 7:17 and invited those present to take copies of available materials. They are also all attached. I expressed thanks to the attendees. He stated that Larry Ramden, Director of Health, would first walk us through his presentation, and then he would take up the present or after the noise ordinance. Director Ramden presented his paper, Sound or Noise Factors to Consider in Regulating Environmental Noise. It's attached, which addressed noise pollution, how noise is measured, the effects of noise on individuals, key issues that communities contend with when developing a noise ordinance, and examples from Somerville and Boston. He concluded that if the town council chooses to approve an ordinance with fixed noise limits, then the departments that have primary jurisdiction over an activity should be empowered to enforce the ordinance. In response to a question about training and equipment, Mr. Random explained there is a 1 to 2 hour training for staff to be certified to use a noise analyzer. The piece of equipment costs about $300 and would need to be calibrated and certified. Residents had very few questions from Mr. Ramden. However, throughout the meeting, residents had both specific questions and general concerns about the updated noise ordinance. See the attached full minutes of April 20, of the April 3rd meeting, Committee for Joint Committee Noise Ordinance. That's attached. Some of those concerns were, can there be restrictions of noise in industrial areas of town that abut residential properties? What can be done about noise from cars, particularly since music is now compressed to boost the bass? What can be done about vibration from noise of a tenant? It was noted that enforcement is often limited due to lack of equipment and that some situations require that the offended party seek civil action. 4, Watertown should look to the noise ordinances from other cities and towns, particularly Newton, when revising our ordinance. 5, the committees and the council as a whole need to recognize that Watertown has undergone significant change since the original noise ordinance was written in 1983. The committees have been provided information about noise standards, zones, dBA levels, absolutes, et cetera, as well as ordinances from other communities. What can be done about leaf blowers? It was noted that leaf blowers, like other maintenance equipment such as lawnmowers, are included in the original ordinance. However, a ban on leaf blowers would need to be a new referral. 8, the noise at Victory Field needs to be addressed, and the school department and recreation department should abide by the noise restrictions. It was noted that with the encouragement of Councilor Picciarelli, both the departments have put into place new regulations and restrictions. For the next hour or so, the committee members engaged in substantive discussion of the latest draft of the noise ordinance, specifically focusing on restrictions of noise pollution. Councilor Feltner expressed concern that the committee should be looking at more than the hours restricting noise pollution and consider other items, such as absolutes, that have been raised by councilors and residents at earlier meetings. During this period, a number of motions were made, discussed, and voted on. Councilor Palumbo made a motion to amend the hours in Section C1 from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. Monday through Friday, seconded by Councilor Falkoff, voted 3 in favor and 2 opposed and 1 present. The motion carried. Councilor Woodland noted that Robert's rules require a majority vote, and since the vote was 3-1, it did not pass. In response, Councilor Falkoff made a motion to reconsider what was seconded by Councilor Feltner and passed 5-1, with Councilor Woodman opposed. Councilor Palumbo repeated his motion to amend the hours in section C1, which was seconded by Councilor Faulkner and passed 4-2, with Councilor Donato and Councilor Woodland voting against the change. Councilor Woodland noted that Robert's rules require that only those on the prevailing side of the 3-2-1 vote could call for reconsideration. In this case, since the motion failed, those who voted against the motion were on the prevailing side. Only Councilor Donato or he could call for reconsideration. Councilor Donato made a motion to reconsider the time changes in C1 so that they read 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. Monday through Friday, and 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Saturday. Councilor Palumbo seconded the motion. It was approved 5-1 with Councilor Woodland voting against the motion. A discussion of the next section, C2, resulted in no change for loading and unloading, deliveries, and truck idling. Councilor Donato noted that these issues come up during the planning and zoning review process when someone is applying for a special permit. Conditions of the permit regarding these issues would supersede the ordinance. A discussion of the next section, section C3, resulted in no changes to the hours, but a request by Councilor Picciarelli to make this section consistent with other sections of the ordinance by including the words legal holidays after the words Saturday and Sunday. Councilor Plummer made the motion. It was seconded by Councilor Felder and passed 5 in favor, with Councilor Bays voting present. After a discussion of how best to proceed with the revisions of the noise ordinance, Councilor Feltner made a motion that the chairs of the 2 committees meet with the town attorney to provide another updated draft noise ordinance to the committees, which includes zones, absolutes, durations, levels, and times, as well as other items previously asked for from staff, such as lay language and charts. The motion was seconded by Councilor Bays and passed 5-1, with Councilor Woodland voting against the motion. Councilor Palumbo ended the meeting by expressing his appreciation to the members of the committees, the residents, Captain Dupree and Mr. Ramden. At 9:40 p.m., Councilor Faulkner made a motion to adjourn, which was seconded by Councilor Bays and passed 6-0. The committee report was prepared by myself. The full minutes of the committee report, which was attached, was prepared by Councilor Feltner.
Thank you very much. Can I get a motion to accept the report?
Mr. President, I make motion to accept the report, subject to the 4 missing attachments being added to the report. The report lists 6 attachments, but 4 of them, the working draft noise ordinance, the sound or noise by Larry Ramden, the Newton noise reference flyer, and the draft summary minutes by Feltner of February 13th joint committee meeting are all missing. In addition, there are several typos on the first page. I am the District C counselor, not the District B counselor. Also on the second page, it refers to changing it so it reads from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. I believe that should be changed 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. in 2 locations. And finally, Captain Dupree's name is misspelled. So with those changes, that's the motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the report? Councilor Falco.
You missed one. There's also a place where it says 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. or,
Right, that should say
PM.
PM.
right. You missed one.
Yeah, I had it written, but I didn't say.
Any other comments on the report? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you, Councilor Palumbo. And thank you to the dual committees, because this has been an awful lot of work, and they're still meeting and still trying to hash this out. Thank you for the update. The next item we have on the agenda is, come on, I'm sorry.
New business.
New business. Any new business to come before the council? Seeing none, communications from the town manager.
There is new business.
New business.
Sorry. We don't do new business.
Communications from the town manager.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I've got 4 items tonight. The first one is one to remind our community on this Friday, July 12th at 11 a.m., there'll be the private first-class Paul James Gorman Memorial Square dedication. As you know, Mr. President, members of the council, The town will be memorializing Private First Class Paul James Gorman. The dedication will be at the corner of Emerson Road and Main Street. Private First Class Gorman was a lifelong resident of Watertown, growing up at 23 Emerson Road before joining the United States Marine Corps. Mr. Gorman was killed in action on July 30th, 1968, while honorably serving our country in Vietnam. So again, it's this Friday morning at the corner of Emerson Road and Main Street at 11 a.m. The second item is just moving forward, and this is both of these events will be before the next town council meeting in August. There'll be the family movie nights both on Friday, July 19, and Friday, August 9th, which have been very popular. That'll be from 6:30 to 10 p.m. with games from 6:30, face painting, et cetera, and the movies will begin at 8 o'clock. The third item I have, Mr. President, members of the council, is related to an action the town council took authorizing back on May 28th, at the May 28th town council meeting. Tonight, this afternoon, we put out a news release regarding Watertown electricity choice. There's a 3-page news media release. I won't read all of it, but I thought it would be important tonight, Mr. President, to kind of read a summary of some of the important items that will be coming forward. The town of Watertown announced today that it's entered into a contract to buy the electricity for the Watertown Electricity Choice Program, which will be launched in September of 2019. The Watertown Electricity Choice is a municipal electricity aggregation, which is a group buying program for electricity supply. Massachusetts state law allows cities and towns to aggregate electricity customers within their borders and select an electricity supplier on behalf of the customers rather than have Eversource buy the electricity. Municipal aggregation is heavily regulated by the state and offers many consumer protections not available with private for-profit programs. The Watertown Electricity Choice will increase the amount of renewable energy in Watertown's electrical supply, providing an additional 35% renewable electricity over and above the state-required minimum amount. With the increasing state renewable energy requirement, Watertown Electricity Choice will provide over 50% local renewable energy in its first full year, going up to 53% in the last year of the contract. Watertown's Electricity Choice program will significantly decrease Watertown's carbon footprint, leading to a cleaner, healthier environment. Another advantage of the Watertown Electricity Choice will be price stability for 27 months. Prices will be fixed from September 2019 to December 2021. That long duration of price makes Watertown Electricity Choice different from Eversource Basic Service, which offers prices that change every 6 months for residential and small business customers and every 3 months for large business customers. Those who are eligible for automatic enrollment will receive a letter in the mail this month with program information, instructions for opting out or opting up, and the enrollment will occur with the September 2019 meter reads and will be seamless. Additionally, Mr. President, lastly, there'll be public information sessions to provide an opportunity for the community to ask questions about the program. They will be held as follows. On Wednesday, July 24, from 2:30 to 6:30, it'll be at the Watertown Farmers Market. There'll be a booth for questions. The second informational session will be July 27 at noon at the Watertown Free Public Library. That will be a formal presentation and questions and answers. And lastly, on August 6th at 10 a.m. at the Watertown Senior Center, again, a formal presentation and question and answers. And then it's on the website, watertownchoice.com, and there'll be more information coming on that. Again, that was a program that was allowed, council authorized the opportunity to go out to move forward this very exciting program. And then the last item I had, Mr. President, I'd certainly be remiss and did want to thank Town Council earlier this evening for the proclamation honoring Brian Costello for his 36 years of service. I'd certainly like to personally thank Mr. Costello for his 36 years of service to our community. Brian worked tirelessly for the citizens of Watertown to provide the highest level of services and improve the quality of life for all of us. I applaud Brian's diligence and dedication to the citizens of this community over the years, and those efforts are very much appreciated. I wish Brian continued happiness, health, and well-earned retirement. The town is a better place due to Mr. Costello's efforts. And on a personal note, I appreciated our working relationships and, more importantly, our friendship. Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. The next item is request for information, and A is a referral to the Committee on Rules and Ordinances for the following matters. And I do want to say that Councilor Falcoff, after our discussion at a previous meeting, did request this, so this is why it's on the agenda. The first item is, what is the intent of request for information section of the council agenda? When is it appropriate to make a request for information at a council meeting? And when is it better to make a phone call and ask the question privately? If there are requests for information which should properly be made in public, how are or should be the replies made available to the public? So can I get a motion to refer this?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second?
Any discussion? Councilor Woodland.
Just, unless I'm missing something, didn't we just do this?
Yeah.
We did, but we did not pass it, and the councilor wanted more discussion about it. He's requesting continued discussion.
I guess if I may follow up with that, on the committee level, we had this discussion, and the resolution we came up with was the one we presented to the council.
And it was defeated.
So I'm not sure, if we go back to the committee, it's probably going to come back the same.
Whoa.
I don't want to presume.
Wait your
what
turn,
the
please. Councilor Cornelis.
Thank you. I spoke about this the last time it was brought up, and I said it was actually allowing ourselves to voluntarily stifle our voices when it comes to requesting information. I mean, this is our opportunity. We represent the citizens, and I don't think we need to be within specific parameters or how and when we're going to be asking for information. And it's just our common sense when we're going to pick up the telephone and make an inquiry, and if it doesn't work, then we bring it forward and offer it in public. And I do support bringing it forward in writing. That's always been the case. I think it's a good opportunity to have a paper trail, but that's as far as it goes, and I will not be supporting bringing it back to committee.
Councilor Picciarelli.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too, we already took this up. We made a decision. We voted. I also point out that we also voted to have the responses for the request for information put on the website. So this seems like this was already discussed and resolved, and I'm not in favor of reopening discussion on this because I think the council has waited on this, and I think what we came up with was appropriate.
Councilor Falcoff.
Well, we came up with nothing. There was a proposed, there was discussion that really didn't answer these questions. This was a referral from President Sedaris, and unfortunately, he was not able to attend the meeting, and so we didn't really understand the referral. And what we decided was to make no changes, but questions were raised about what is the purpose of this, how should it be used, what's appropriate and what's not, and I felt like they were not answered.
Councilor Donato.
Thank you, Mr. President. To reiterate, and with all due respect to Councilor Falcoff, what some of the other councilors have said, at the last subcommittee meeting, we tried to come up with an objective standard, which was voted down, and it seems to me that a lot of the items contained in this referral are really subjective, and if we couldn't come up with, agree to make a change objectively, I'm not sure we're going to make any progress with regard to these subjective questions. I think the other point I would make is that the rules will be reviewed come January, so any, just with the timeline, I'm not sure, even if something was voted into place, it would maybe only be in place for a couple months before it'd be reviewed next term anyway. So I will not be, again, with all due respect, supporting this.
Counselor Feltner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just say, some of these questions look like they were exactly what was in the minutes, the questions that weren't answered because neither President Sedaris or the town manager could make the meeting. So I guess that is to say I can understand why she's bringing this forward, and I don't know how President Sedaris feels about it. The main question that wasn't answered is why we had the referral in the first place, and what the purpose of request for information is, if there's beyond the obvious of what Councilor Canellis stated. So I'm not against reviewing it again, but I also understand the timeline and doesn't seem like an urgent matter. So.
Are there any other comments? I'm going to also vote against it because it's obvious that this committee is, satisfied with the actions that were taken, and I think that the will has been spoken to, and as Councilor Donato pointed out, these will be reviewed in 5 months. So, any other comments? All those in favor of the referral?
Yes.
All those opposed?
Opposed.
No.
Opposed.
The motion gets defeated.
Oh, well.
The next item is a review of the language in the request for information section of the council rules that refer to what to do if the questioner is not satisfied with the answer or if the answer is not provided in a timely way. Someone make that motion?
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. Councilor Picciarelli.
This is sort of, was part of the previous thing that we just voted down. This was part of that same thing, and we asked that question, and it was discussed at the committee, and I'm satisfied with the vote we took, leaving the rules written as they currently stand. So I would be voting no on this.
Councilor Falcoff.
So this one, I feel more comfortable waiting until the rules are reviewed in January. I would have really liked to have had the other discussion about what's the philosophy here. But this one, I would be happy to withdraw my motion, if someone wants to withdraw the second.
Second.
Okay. Withdrawn. Thank you. The next item is referral to the Committee on Economic Development and Planning. I'm sorry, on Rules and Ordinances. It should be Economic Development and Planning, I believe.
Yeah.
The consideration of recreational marijuana local options. I believe that the committee is also, working on host agreements, so I think that same committee should be working on the local options if this gets referred.
So, okay, so I'll refer to Economic Development and Planning.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I will say that Councilor Feltner has forwarded some options to us for consideration. Councilor Falcoff.
I just have a question. It seems that these really should have been new business, and so I'm just confused about
Should have been what?
under new business. I don't know why these are requests for information, review of pending matters, while we're on the subject that I'm raising of what means what on this agenda.
That's fine. Good move, good call. Councilor Canellis.
Thank you. This really isn't a request for information, but a comment just to follow up to Mr. Driscoll announcement of the community aggregate meetings, and I didn't hear any evening hours. I think it would be important to have at least one.
Okay, announcements. I'm sorry. Are there any other requests for information at this point? Announcements. Public forum. Any member of the public wish to be heard? Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you.